Welcome to Non-Toxic. My name is Daniel Penny. I'm a journalist and critic who's been covering the intersection of culture and climate for outlets like the New York Times, the Financial Times, GQ, and the New Yorker.
And I'm Andrew S. Lewis, an environmental journalist who writes for the New York Times Magazine, Outside Magazine, Yale Environment 360, and others.
On this podcast, we invite listeners to critically examine the relationship between masculinity and climate, to hear from experts from around the world and learn from the experiences of everyday guys like themselves. Some of the people we'll meet are doing incredible things to understand our environment and mitigate climate change. Others are undermining these efforts at every turn, and we're going to call them out. We don't claim to have all the answers. We hope you'll join us as we try to figure out what it means to be non-toxic.
Just like in the animal kingdom, there are some men who are bigger, stronger, more dominant. In human society, men with these traits are at the top of the social hierarchy. They have more friends, more sexual relationships, better jobs. That's the way the world is, and there's nothing you can do about it. Or that's how the so-called manosphere sees the world, at least.
In this two-part episode, we're talking about the myth of the alpha male, where it came from, how it's developed, and why it's remained so prevalent in our culture, despite the fact that a lot of research has overturned the idea. Perhaps the group most obsessed with the idea of alpha males are incels, involuntary celibate men, that is, who have adopted an elaborate pseudoscientific misogyny that explains why women won't have sex with them. For some incels, there's no changing their lot in life, but others are convinced that with enough effort and the right social hacks, they can become alphas too. This infatuation with alphas is part of a bigger conversation about how we think nature operates, and therefore how human society should be organized. The incel worldview looks at the behavior of wild animals, especially macho, violent animals like wolves, and projects those behaviors onto men as general principles to live by, or iron laws of nature that cannot be escaped. If we really do live in a world of all against all, where a good position in society can only be achieved through violence and brute force, then anything and everything is permissible. On this season of Non-Toxic, we'll be talking about the ways masculinity intersects with the many planetary crises we're experiencing at the moment. Global warming, the proliferation of forever chemicals, the great biodiversity die-off. But we wanted to start by looking at something more fundamental, to try to get at how ideas of nature and manhood are bound up. We'll be overturning some big rocks. Don't be surprised if there's something nasty growing underneath. And a quick warning to listeners, this episode does contain some disturbing content. So, Andrew, I'm going to share with you a little video I found on TikTok of what I think this is real. I've tried to verify its authenticity and I haven't succeeded, but it's this video of what looks like a high school student basically just like mouthing off to his teacher in what maybe is the most delusional display I've ever seen of someone thinking that they can be an alpha. So we're just going to give that a little listen.
This punishment stuff is going to stop.
You're not gonna tell me what I'm gonna do and not do.
I am now the alpha.
Bro, that's not how this works. I am the teacher.
The alpha takes priority over the teacher. The alpha takes priority over everything. Do you not know how that works?
The teacher is telling the alpha to sit in this seat right now.
And the alpha doesn't have to listen to orders from its lower.
Well, you don't have to listen, but the consequences that follow are going to still apply to the alpha.
The alpha doesn't take punishment.
Let's see how well that works out for you, okay?
Oh my gosh.
Amazing, right?
To be a teacher in 2023, just the conviction there is, I mean, obviously we're laughing, but it's not funny.
It's tempting to dismiss the manosphere as just a bunch of pent-up young men complaining on the internet, kind of like that kid we just saw in the video. But we can't, and we shouldn't anymore. Increasingly, incels are committing targeted acts of violence against women, as well as mass shootings. In the past decade, 59 people, that's kids and adults, have been murdered in 15 different attacks by young men who identified as incels. And then there's a whole host of other mass shootings and killings that have occurred where the shooter has been in some way connected to incels through, they visited certain forums, even if they weren't a self-identified member. So the influence is actually maybe greater than we realize. And the ideology of incels is complex and often contradictory, but at the core of this movement is a web of pseudoscientific ideas about the way human society is ultimately just a brutal system defined by a sexual marketplace in which only the fittest guys survive and reproduce. And the rage incels feel about not being alphas, being victims of what they call the genetic lottery, is increasingly turning into violence.
In this two-parter, Daniel and I, we're going to tackle this issue from both sides. He spoke to Callum Hood. He's an expert on incels and the manosphere and other corners of the internet I just never want to see. And I spoke with Connor Meyer, a wildlife biology student whose research is helping to upend our understanding of the animal we think most about when we think about alphas and betas, the wolf. So Daniel, tell me more about Callum Hood, a man whose job I have to imagine is just incredibly difficult, not easy at all.
Callum's the head of research at the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is a nonprofit. They've got branches in Washington, D.C. and London, and they study hate groups and misinformation online. He's responsible for the center's reports on things like the anti-vax industry and Islamophobia. And more broadly, he's interested in how social media and tech companies profit from disinformation and hate on their platforms. I actually met Callum at a conference about researching the far right, where he was giving a presentation on the manosphere, and I knew I wanted to learn more. So I called Callum up to talk about where incels came from, how far their ideas have spread, and why they are so fixated on alphas. More after the break.
Today's episode of Non-Toxic is sponsored by Fruling, a New York-based snack company making next-level trail mix with heirloom varieties of nuts, berries, and whole-roasted cacao beans.
This type of quality is normally reserved for Michelin star chefs, but Fruling sources directly from small organic farms in the most mineral-rich regions of the world.
Find Fruling products at select boutiques and health food stores or order directly online. Listeners can use the code NONTOXIC, that's in all caps, for 20% off orders at fruling.co/shop. Fruling, naturally delicious.
Callum, welcome to Non-Toxic. Great to have you here.
Great to meet you.
So I thought maybe we could start by just getting a little bit of background on who you are and what you do. How did you come to study incels through your work at the Center for Countering Digital Hate? And maybe you could talk about how they fit into the larger universe of groups that you track and research.
Yeah, so I'm the head of research at the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, and we're fairly unique in that we work on how all different kinds of hate and misinformation are spread on the biggest social media platforms and the role that those platforms play in enabling it, amplifying it, spreading it. Now, I personally have always had a very strong interest in misogyny, online misogyny in particular. I remember sort of like 10 years ago reading the We Hunted the Mammoth blog, being very well versed on pickup artists, on men's rights activists and sort of, old manosphere. And so in my present job, we were just actually, by sheer coincidence, beginning to put some work together and some plans together about how we could investigate incel communities, say something interesting about them, say something about the way big tech enables them. I did some work when we were putting together our reports to just sort of survey how many killings have been associated with incels. There's some really interesting stuff about how mass shootings that we consider to be white supremacist mass shootings often have really misogynist features in there as well. I think the big goal here is actually to say something illuminating and insightful about what all these different manosphere communities online have in common and how the community has changed since around a decade ago, when the sort of leading figures in it were men's rights activists, were pickup artists, were a bit more identifiable. In some ways, it was easier to point out what was toxic about them. And I think that's really changed. I think many of these communities now go to great efforts to make themselves look more benign.
That's really interesting that you said that now they're more socially acceptable, because I think of the pickup artistry as kind of harmless in comparison. There was that show on, I think it was VH1, about pickup artistry. I don't know
Yeah.
if you caught that.
Last season on The Pickup Artist, a man named Mystery took 8 lovable losers
I'm petrified of trying to go up to a woman.
and turned them into Casanovas.
I get it. I know what's going on.
Now, he's back.
I am Mystery.
I mean, they are comical figures when you look at them, especially when you look at, the ones who were popular 10 or so years ago. But we've got to remember that even some of them, propose really extreme views. I mean, the thing I always say on this is it's not a coincidence that more than one pickup artist ended up writing into materials that they themselves published that they'd raped someone. They would describe rape. So Roosh V is the most famous of these, and he's reinvented himself now. But he had written into one of his books what is a straightforward account of a rape. He just describes. He says that he has sex with a woman who had not consented. And I think that's beneath the sort of comical appearances of these people. There is an absolute contempt for the notion of consent. It is, just a barrier to be overcome. And if you really deeply subscribe to that, then rape is kind of the moral force of it is sort of eroded, I think.
I want to define some terms here, because I think the manosphere and the incelosphere have a lot of complex keywords and definitions, some of which are quite esoteric. And I want to center, I think, the figure of the alpha, which is central to all of these galaxies and communities. The alpha is a pretty ubiquitous idea in pop culture. Can you explain what incels mean when they talk about an alpha or a beta or an omega? And if there are any other concepts that you think we need to know in order to understand this worldview?
Well, an alpha is supposed to be a sort of socially successful man, typically because they have social skills, because they are physically attractive, usually thought of as intelligent as well, because they're supposed to be sort of successful in their career. And indeed, many incels, and indeed in the wider manosphere that also subscribes to some of these ideas, the money is seen as being key to part of what makes them attractive. And then as you go down the scale, and the level of contempt reserved for each of these levels on the scale varies, betas are supposed to be, in contrast to alphas, followers. So alphas are supposed to be leaders in some sense, dominant, whereas betas are supposed to be more sort of compliant. But betas, there is room for them to be sort of moderately sexually successful in the eyes of incels and other members of the manosphere. But not dominant. They would follow the lead of an alpha in a room. In some bits of the manosphere, there's a concept known as mogging, which is where an alpha asserts his dominance in a social situation over lower orders of male. And then you get further down the scale. I mean, there's omegas would be the sort of characters that incels see themselves as: no sexual success, not attractive, not charismatic, pretty much completely isolated. And incels have a very sharp view of the world, where they think this is almost determined at birth. It is determined by the genetic lottery, and then the lottery of where you're born and how you're raised. But they have a very strong view that, that there are circumstances you can be born into that mean that you will simply never have any opportunity to form any kind of sexual relationship. And that's that. And this is where this sort of nihilism creeps in.
And what about Chads and Stacys? Is a Chad like an alpha? And what is a Stacy?
Yeah, I mean, Chad and Alpha are related. I think Chad is almost a more sort of derogatory term. I mean, it's said almost with a kind of poisonous envy. It's the image of this extremely muscular, chiseled guy who has enormous sexual success, but is almost to the point of ridicule. Stacys are then supposed to be kind of the equivalent on the female side. They're supposed to be the most attractive women as compared to Becky's that are sort of like your betas who are sort of moderately attractive women.
Where where do these ideas come from in the incel culture? Can you talk a little bit about the development from earlier pickup artistry and the manosphere 1.0? I know that Reddit was the home for a long time of the incel community, but I think it's worth maybe sketching out a brief timeline of where incels came from and how we've gotten to the moment we're in now.
Well, there's kind of two starting points because some of the earliest incel communities, I mean, one of them famously was founded by a woman and was intended. I think the original term as well was involcel. Involuntary celibate is the root phrase, and so that was open to both genders. It was more honestly intended as a sort of support network, but over time became more and more toxic. And you talk about these communities on Reddit that have a history with the incel communities. One of those that's really important is one called PUA Hate. And that was actually a sort of reaction to pickup artists. And it was basically men who had tried pickup artists' advice, had tried to apply it in the hopes that would be a sort of simple formula for sexual success, and had found it lacking, and therefore hated pickup artists and everything that they represented. And again, you've got this nihilism, this sort of giving up on any chance of developing relationships and coming to a view that society is just structured this way, and there's no way out of this, and that just turns into a sort of rancid hatred then of society and of women in particular.
You mentioned incels think that society is just structured this way. Is it something that they look to the animal world to explain? How is the natural world used in the philosophies of the incel community to understand their predicament?
Well, they're very interested in sort of evolutionary psychology, and they maintain their own Wikipedia that is sort of heavily sourced with scientific papers, but of dubious sort of relevance. And they assemble this into a very sort of survival of the fittest view of human society and of sexual relationships in particular. And they are particularly attracted to any ideas that suggest that women are attracted to negative traits. So, they love to repeat sort of cherry pick bits of evidence from academic literature about, for example, women being attracted to psychopaths or women being attracted to violence in some sense. And they use this to build an image that there's this sort of totally unjust and morally corrupt structure to society where the strongest and fittest dominate. And if you're a man born weak and physically unattractive, there is just no chance for you. And it's sort of, it's really designed to sort of justify a very black and white moral interpretation of society where they are the victims, and I think this is something they've got in common with the rest of the manosphere. The message is that things are inverted. It's not the women who face inequality, who are at a disadvantage. It's the men. And you need to wake up to that fact. And in incel communities, they use all this evolutionary psychology stuff to try and suggest that there's just no way that a man with, similar characteristics themselves can be successful in society, and therefore that society is at its base sort of morally corrupt.
Can you talk about red pills versus black pills? Because it was my understanding that red pills, it's that realization that actually we're the victims,
Mhm.
but there's something we can do about it. And it was my understanding that with black pills, they maybe take a different
Yeah.
perspective.
I mean, I think we need to be conscious that like these pill terms can be extremely flexible, and there's a huge proliferation of different sort of ex-pill terms that all different sorts of communities use. You take the red pill and you become awake to this real reality that men are the ones who are disadvantaged and that women hold a lot of advantages in society.
After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
For example, they would argue that women are able to use sexual influence and their sort of sexual currency to get ahead in their careers in a way that many men can't. That's one of the ways that they rationalize it and justify it. Now, if you take that sort of meaning of red pill, there are a number of manosphere communities that you could describe as red pill. And it's this sense that that's where you start, and there is something that you can do to correct this. So pickup artists are in this sense a sort of red pill part of the manosphere, because they have a sort of formula that you can follow that will make you sexually successful. And almost the prerequisite is understanding the reality of things, and then you can almost hack it. You just apply the formula and you'll be sexually successful. Men's rights activists, in some senses, are a bit red pill as well, in that they again take as their starting point that actually the world is tilted against men, but through activism, you will be able to change this in some way. If we change the rules on divorce, say, if we change the rules on child support payments, we'll begin to correct this inequality. And there's all sorts of stuff there about, they talk about paper abortions, which is this idea that men should have a right to cut off any financial support to children that they've fathered. So that's red pill. And then incels are sometimes described as a black pill community, because again, it takes the same starting point. The world is tilted against men, but they say there is nothing to be done about it. And that's where you get this very violent, dark, despairing sort of view of the world that justifies really extreme statements about women being worthless, about society being, justifying statements about mass killings and so on, and the veneration of people like Elliot Rodgers. He's probably the most famous incel mass murderer. That they were doing something that was morally right because they were trying to sort of just extract vengeance on this morally corrupt society that they see in front of them.
Let's talk about Elliot Rodgers a little bit. Unfortunately, there have been so many mass shootings in America and around the world, but especially in America, that many people probably won't remember who Elliot Rodgers is. So that was in 2014, right? Can you talk about that shooting and who he is?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the key features of the Elliot Rodgers mass killing were he was a young guy. He, I think, referred to himself as a gentleman, and he filmed himself. So I think one of the things that makes him unique is that there is this sort of last testament in the form of, as we see with many mass shooters who go on to have a sort of broader influence on violent movements. He left behind a manifesto of sorts in the form of recordings that he'd made in his car, which are venerated in some parts of the incel community. They like to sort of present images of him. They sort of refer to him as the supreme gentleman, and they see him as kind of as a victim, really, who was justified. And another thing that makes him unique is that he targeted a sorority house. So it was quite clearly in the framing of incel communities intended to be an attack on those women who were viewed as most privileged, most advantaged by society. He holds a completely unique sort of position in incel mythology, and to the extent that where any mass killing is referred to as going ER. So he's really the archetype on how you would carry out such an attack.
I thought it might be worth looking at a few extracts from his manifesto, My Twisted World, which speak to some of the kind of main themes we've been talking about. This is just, I think, a really interesting moment where he kind of brings in race as well to the misogyny. And this is when he first goes to college, or when he writes about his first weeks in college at Santa Barbara. I'm just going to read a little bit. That's all right.
Yeah.
My first week turned out to be very unpleasant, leaving a horrific first impression of my new life in Santa Barbara. My 2 housemates were nice, but they kept inviting over this friend of theirs named Chance. He was a black boy who came over all the time, and I hated his cocksure attitude. Inevitably, a vile incident occurred between me and him. I was eating a meal in the kitchen when he came over and started bragging to my housemates about his success with girls. I couldn't stand it, so I proceeded to ask them all if they were virgins. They all looked at me weirdly and said that they had lost their virginity long ago. I felt so inferior, as it reminded me of how much I missed out in life. And then, this black boy named Chance said that he lost his virginity when he was only 13. In addition, he said that the girl he lost his virginity to was a blonde white girl. I was so enraged that I almost splashed him with my orange juice. I indignantly told him that I did not believe him, and then I went to my room to cry. I cried and cried and cried, and then I called my mother, and I cried to her on the phone. How could an inferior, ugly black boy be able to get a white girl and not me? I am beautiful, and I am half white myself. I am descended from British aristocracy. He is descended from slaves. I deserve it more. I tried not to believe his foul words, but they were already said, and it was hard to erase them from my mind. If this is actually true, if this ugly black filth was able to have sex with a blonde white girl at the age of 13, while I've had to suffer virginity all my life, then this just proves how ridiculous the female gender is. They would give themselves to this filthy scum, but reject me, the injustice.
It's stunning the sense of entitlement in the way a hierarchy of race shows itself in that manifesto. And you've got this two-way thing. I mean, I mentioned earlier that you've got white supremacists often talk about white women as their role is to marry white men and create white children. And there's this sense that to do anything else is a betrayal, and that white men are sort of entitled to marry white women. And that's present in his manifesto as well.
There's a lot of research that shows that young men hit a kind of peak age for committing acts of violence and being involved in extremist groups. I think sometimes the number is around 25 is like the peak. And then after that, there's usually a drop off. Is that the same for incels? Like, do incels age out of the community, or do they just kind of get trapped and stay there forever?
This is really hard to know. You know, most, you know, we tried to, in our own research, try to draw as many conclusions as we could about the user base. And we asked ourselves questions like, can we say something sensible about how old they are on average? But this is a community that's very, very conscious that it's sort of under scrutiny, despite the fact that these websites are usually open because they want as many people to read their content as possible. And so there's very little sort of demographic information out there about the age of incels and when people might leave the communities. Now, I've got to say, we are in a very sort of unique week in terms of news for the incel community, as in one of the leading moderators of the main online incel community has announced that he has formed a sexual relationship. As I recall, he was identified by the New York Times, I believe he's in his late 20s or early 30s. And this has sort of triggered an enormous reaction from continued members of the incel community. Some of them have attacked him as a traitor, whereas others think that that's the goal, ultimately, is to leave. There are subreddits as well to do with leaving the incel community. And when you look at them closely, they actually subscribe to the ideology. They're just looking to what they call in their terminology to ascend. That is to have sex, form a sexual relationship, and no longer be an involuntary celibate, a virgin. So it's quite hard to know how many people are moving on there's certainly from our research, there's some very young members of the incel community who describe being in school and so on. And there's also some much older members of the incel community on there in their sort of 40s and 50s. So this is not limited just to young men. There are older men involved as well, but it's not clear what the typical sort of timeline is. I mean, again, another thing that we were able to tell from our analysis of posts on the leading incel forum was that
And what are those leading incel forums, just so that our listeners can steer clear?
I don't typically name them in interviews because I don't want to promote them. They've made a very deliberate decision to make pretty much all the content on these forums open. And by the way, I mean, we've not discussed that there's a small network of forums around the main explicitly incel forum. And I think it's designed to funnel young men into them. It's really extreme content. And it's been linked. There was at least one case where someone who had planned a shooting, I don't think carried it out, had been sort of identified as a member of this forum. So I tend to exercise a high level of caution with it. But one of the things we found was because of that open structure, there's lots and lots of visits to these sites that basically can't be accounted for by the number of active members. So there's a lot of people who come to these incel sites to observe, and then a much smaller number become members, and then a much smaller number still become active members. And then of them, there's a hardcore, I think it's in the hundreds, as I recall from our analysis, that supplies a huge fraction of the post. So I think it's only a very small number of men become deeply committed members of these forums, very active, and sort of carry the development of this community along. But those that do get that involved in it, I mean, they are subscribed to like a really dark and sort of demonstrably dangerous worldview.
How widespread are these ideas outside of this, 400 or 500 hardcore incels?
This I think is the really interesting question. It's something that's a bit hard to measure because incel terminology actually has quite a lot in common with the broader manosphere terminology used. I think it's sometimes a bit difficult to pick out individual concepts and say, well, that's something that really truly originates in incel communities. It's something I really want our research to sort of speak to in the long run. But I think incels are quite a well-known sort of subculture now, despite how actually small the active community is in the thousands or tens of thousands. It's got this massive sort of cultural influence. I'm not sure what the exact etymology of the word chaddies, but certainly like associations that have grown up around the concept of a chad and this sort of dual nature of it being something to be envied, but also ridiculed and hated. I think the incel community has a much broader sort of cultural influence. And, I think it almost moves, I hate using this phrase, but moves the Overton window on this stuff, right? It makes a lot of other stuff that actually is kind of just like a mild version of the incel ideology, the concept that men are disadvantaged and women have these special advantages that need to be talked about, and that there's a sort of aggrieved and entitled section of men in Western society that need their entitlements sort of listened to. I think there's a lot of that at large in the wider manosphere, and we begin to look at it as if it's actually it's not that threatening, because in contrast to the most extreme stuff on incel forums, it doesn't look that bad, doesn't look that threatening. But I think they're having a sort of gravitational effect on this wider conversation, and there's a lot of ideas are being exported out, and there's some really big figures in the manosphere have sort of discuss inceldom. There's a set, I won't name them, but there's a set of sort of captive experts on incels who explain away the entire thing as a sort of ironic expression of rage that none of us need worry about. And it gets a lot of traction in some sections of the manosphere as well. Our own analysis showed that there's a post about rape every 29 minutes on the main incel, most popular incel forum. Some of these apologists go to the extreme of saying that even terminology excusing rape, justifying paedophilia, justifying mass murder, that it all needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. It's all an ironic expression not to be taken seriously. And what is actually to be taken seriously is the entitlements of these men. And we need to help these men and don't worry about the way that they express this stuff. And I think it becomes such a big ask of people to really invert their natural understanding of expressions about killing women, that women are sort of worthless other than as sex objects. I mean, this is a sort of ideology that justifies violence and objectifies women. There's no two ways around it. And at the point you were saying, actually, that they don't mean it, I think it's just not credible, really.
I want to end with two questions. The first connects to what you just mentioned, the kind of, oh, we need to just help these boys and we shouldn't worry too much about the extremity of what they're saying because it's all internet irony. What is to be done about this community? Like, I see people, students, express ideas that are definitely incel light.
Mm-hmm.
I come across it all the time on Twitter or on TikTok or Instagram, and it doesn't seem like the tide is turning. It seems like this is becoming more pervasive, more acceptable. And I imagine a group like yours is very much interested in tracking and ultimately helping to stop the flow of this kind of hate. Can you talk about what comes next?
Yeah, I mean, look, what we've been trying to say is young men who might be attracted to these communities, the serious issues that they've got, and something we need to talk about here is what we call the incelosphere, the network of sites around this main one that were all founded by the same two people. And when you realise what these other forums are about, it's very illuminating. You've got one that's for young men that are not in education or in employment. You've got one for a suicide forum, which is the only one of all of them that's open to both genders, and then another for the practice of what's called looksmaxing, which is in some cases really extreme measures, such as taking a hammer to your face to try and change the way that you look. Lots of recommendations on surgery, working out, diet, but also more extreme measures. So it seems clear from that these forums are intended to appeal to a demographic of young men that have serious body image issues, and in many cases are not in education, or they've got nothing going on, they're quite isolated, and might have sort of mental health issues as well, to the extent they might even be suicidal. That's the sort of demographic here. And we did an analysis that shows that there is overlap between these forums, as well as them being operated and founded by the same two individuals. So there's real problems there, and I think some of them need to be addressed. Body image, for example, we've done a lot of work at my organisation on the sort of way that social media influences the body image of young girls. That's going on with young men as well. It's not got enough sort of coverage, but there's really extreme pressures on young men around body image and around expectations of sexual success that are big, serious pressures. I think another one is sort of it's a reaction to rising equality between the sexes. And of course, there is not equality between the sexes still, but there's some sort of sense that things have changed to the disadvantage of men. And there's a sort of howl of anguish coming from some men who feel particularly disadvantaged, and the message that this is basically the price you personally are paying for women being more equal is an attractive one for some of these young men. But those are big issues, and I think it's going to take a lot of work to really drag them into the light and then defeat them over the long term. What we did say is that there are some basic practical steps that could be taken now to try and stymie the flow of young men that have these issues. And if they go to an incel forum, they're going to get the worst, most toxic advice possible. And so that's where we said that, big tech companies bear some responsibility. So, for example, there are many terms associated with inceldom or looksmaxing or unemployment or whatever, that if you put them into Google, these incelosphere sites rank really, really high. They're going to be on the first page of results or the second page of results. And so, given the relationship of this community with actual violence against women, it's not theoretical, and we've got to emphasize that. We think there's an argument there for Google to sort of downrank these sites, because they're toxic not just to young men, but the people around them as well.
The last question I have for you is more about you personally, Callum. You mentioned that you didn't want to give the names of some of these sites. They were extremely toxic and often disturbing in their content. Can you just talk about your journey into this world and how it's affected you?
Well, I think the shocking thing is that virtually any time you log on to that forum and look at the latest posts, it's always so visceral, horrific, really sort of graphic descriptions of violence and of sexual violence and are never very far away. And another thing that really shocked us was, and again, I think it goes down to this absolute contempt for the notion of consent. It's surprising how much discussion there is on the forum of the legitimacy of child abuse. There's sort of no bottom to this thing when you go and look at it. There's young men spending 10 hours a day on this, and the effect that must have on you in terms of how hardened you become to this attitude to, talking about violence against women just for hours a day. I don't know what effect that must have on some of these young men. It's quite depressing, and you become quite concerned for some of them in a way. So it does affect you. I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, we did this as a team, and we did that in part to share the burden, and we learned a lot in the process. I had to tell members of my team to just take a 2-week break from the project. We just stopped work on it, just so, it seems like a trivial thing, but just to have some time off it, because staring at this stuff constantly and reading it is affecting. It's depressing, and it begins to make you sort of, and this is true of our work in general, where we work on hate and misinformation. You can begin to get a sort of cynicism or pessimism about the world, and you begin to think, like, how many people out there believe this stuff? You might bump into someone at the pub or something, and they express something that's adjacent to something that you're working on. I think I had a guy in a pub the other week overheard me saying something about Andrew Tate or something and started trying to challenge me on it, and you begin to think, God, how many of these people are out there? But you've got to remember that these are, in many cases, not particularly popular communities, and at least they are visible. We can do some work on them. There are some concrete steps that can be done to tackle them. But it's difficult, yeah. We've got to manage our exposure to this stuff.
Wow. Callum, thank you so much for talking with us about the work
You're very
you've been
welcome.
doing. It was fascinating and at times quite disturbing view into a world that I think we hear a lot about but don't really understand. And unfortunately, I think it's essential that we do come to grips with it.
Oh, thanks very much. It's been good to talk about it.
That was Callum Hood from the Center for Countering Digital Hate. You can find a link to the report he wrote on incels in our show notes. More in a moment. So, Andrew, was that everything you wanted to learn about incels and more?
Yeah, it's it begs the question, that how are we approaching this now, where it's becoming a growing problem? How do you address it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been reading a lot of articles from teachers, actually, where they talk about the differences they're noticing in their middle school and high school age students who seem to be increasingly spouting, talking points from Tate or from other manosphere influencers. I think it's hard to say definitively how widespread these ideas are, but they're just kind of in the ether. And that's part of what makes them so poisonous, is that they seem to kind of just shift what is acceptable to varying degrees. And what we can tolerate. The example that we watched at the top of the show is quite comical, but I think it shows that it's real, you know?
Yeah.
Speaking of classrooms, I want to talk about the science classroom. So next week, you're going to be speaking with a biologist, our PhD biology student at the University of Montana by the name of Connor Mayer. And it's my understanding that he's done some research on why certain wolves exhibit aggressive alpha-like behavior. Can you give us a little hint at what's coming up next week?
Okay, I'm going to give you a hint, but it's going to be a real small hint. 2 words. Brainworms.
And that's it for our show. Non-Toxic is a production of Loose Thread Studios.
Art is by Sam Creasy. Music is by Nathan Sharp. Today's episode of Non-Toxic is sponsored by Fruling, a New York-based snack company making next-level trail mix with heirloom varieties of nuts, berries, and whole-roasted cacao beans.
We're a listener-supported show, and we can't make Non-Toxic without your help. To keep the podcast going, visit patreon.com/nontoxicpodcast and become a patron today. We've got some excellent swag for our patrons, and we are excited to share more of that soon.
You can also sign up for a monthly non-toxic newsletter at nontoxicpodcast.substack.com. We'll keep you in the loop on announcements about the show, climate news, and weird weather.
And please don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps people find us. But nothing does that better than telling somebody you know about this podcast. Help us spread the word.